Welcome back to part 2 of our blog series on the Islamic Golden Age. Last time, we discussed the scientific and philosophical advancements of the Islamic world at the macro level, how the stage was set for arguably the greatest intellectual revolution in history. We talked about some of the fields of study which saw revolutionary development, things like that. For part 2, I want to zoom in on some of the individual titans of this age, to look at the genius polymaths who carried the torch of knowledge to incredible heights. So, without further ado, let's get started. I absolutely recommend that you read the first blog post, linked to here. Bit of a recap for those who have. You'll recall that in 762, the Beit al-Hikmah, or House of Wisdom, is founded in Baghdad. This library would become the epicenter of knowledge and learning in all of Afro-Eurasia. Knowledge was collected throughout the known world and brought back to the Beit al-Hikmah, where it was then translated into Arabic, meaning that any prospective learner need only master one language in order to access it. This made it remarkably easy for bright minds to enter into the field of learning and to go on to make great scientific and philosophical strides. Along with this accessibility came a very cosmopolitan and inclusive attitude. Religious and ethnic ties did not bar a scholar from contributing to the collective wisdom. With that recollection in mind, let's move on to our first figure. Regarded as the father of Arabic philosophy, AlKindi was fundamental in the curation of classical philosophy for the Beit al-Hikmah. He was instrumental in synthesizing classical philosophy for the Muslim world, incorporating Islamic principles into philosophical texts. He wasn't much of a linguist, he didn't even know Greek, but he was a phenomenal polymath. He worked to pioneer the implementation of the Indian numeral system we use today, and his mathematical expertise materialized in the fields of cryptanalysis, ciphers, and statistics. He was a sincere chemist who expounded on distillation methods for wine and perfumes as well. He developed a scale to assist physicians in accurately measuring the quantities of medicine. He wrote over 200 books in his lifetime, and this is a number that we'll repeat for several scholars, covering a multitude of disciplines. To top it all off, he was quite the musician as well. Music was considered a sincere science, and if you've ever pored over a sheet of music, you'll understand why. Music was considered the science of math in time, and AlKindi was a pioneer in Arab music theory, and even made improvements to the oud, a cousin of the European lute. Al-Farabi picked up where AlKindi left off. He was widely regarded as the second teacher, with the first teacher being Aristotle, so this should give you an idea of the clout he carried. He was an advocate for the academic community, maintaining that rational reasoning was superior to divine revelation. The idea we talked about in part 1, about how philosophers would use scientific reasoning as a means to better understand Allah or God's creation, this stems in part from Al-Farabi. He introduced methodology into metaphysical philosophy, taking it beyond the sphere of classical conjecture and morphing it into a science. Speaking of science, one of his most significant contributions was to the study of vacuums in the 10th century, no less. He falsely believed that air would fill any available space and that perfect vacuums could not exist, but given the century, we can more than forgive him for that error. He also studied music and was a pioneer in music therapy. Obviously, psychology was a strong field for him, and he also made investigations into social psychology. We talked about Al-Razi in part 1 when we discussed the foundation of the hospital in Baghdad. Al-Razi is regarded today as one of the greatest physicians of all time, and Iran still celebrates Razi Day on August 27th. He was a rigorous scientist and is the first known person to use control groups in studies, particularly for smallpox and meningitis treatments. He was a remarkable botanist and pharmacist as well. In one of his writings, he remarked on the medicinal differences between Spanish saltwort and Indian saltwort. He's also a wonderful example of how the Arabic scholars were critical of famous figures from the classical age. In his doubts about Galen, he criticized the four humors concept, which would still be extremely widespread during the European Renaissance. And he did this always with a scientific eye. When criticizing Galen's concept of the transference of warmth, he noted that the consumption of a warm beverage can elevate a body temperature higher than that of the beverage itself, and concluded that a complex physiological response must be taking place. Next up, we have Al-Haytham, the father of the scientific method. 600 years before Descartes, he wrote this: "We should distinguish the properties of particulars, and gather by induction what pertains to the eye, and what is found in the manner of sensation to be uniform, unchanging, manifest, and not subject to doubt. After which we should ascend in our inquiry and reasoning, gradually and orderly, criticizing premises and exercising caution in regard to conclusions. Our aim in all that we make subject to inspection and review being to employ justice, not to follow prejudice, and to take care in all that we judge and criticize, that we seek the truth, and not be swayed by opinion." End quote. In addition to this credit, he is also considered the father of optics. He was most noted for transforming the field of optics into a legitimate science. One of his predecessors, Ibn Sahl, was the first to put down the law of refraction, but he was focused on the production of lenses to focus light for the purposes of burning things. We here at GSM can certainly empathize with that pyromania, but Al-Haytham focused his sights on more scientific ends. He was the first to discover that light reflects off of an object and is captured by the eyes, and he also argued that vision occurs not in the eyes, but in the brain. Al-Haytham was also a vocal opponent of those who took the classical greats at their word without scrutinizing them. One of the letters to a critic reads thus, quote, "From the statements made by the noble sheikh, it is clear that he believed in Ptolemy's words and everything he says, without relying on a demonstration or calling on a proof, but by pure imitation. That is how experts in the prophetic tradition have faith in prophets, may the blessing of Allah be upon them. But that is not the way that mathematicians have faith in specialists in the demonstrative sciences. And I have taken note that it gives him pain that I have contradicted Ptolemy, and that he finds it distasteful. His statements suggest that error is foreign to Ptolemy. Now there are many errors in Ptolemy, in many passages of his books. If he wishes me to specify them and point them out, I shall do so." End quote. Al-Haytham then goes on to list the many errors in the Almagest, Book of Optics, and Book of Hypotheses. What a rock star. Speaking of rock stars, next we have Ibn Sina, and he was a cult of personality. Born to members of the ruling Samanid elite in Bukhara, he lived a life that could have served as inspiration for the most wild of 80s rock stars. He was wildly hedonistic and loved wine and women. He was cocky to the extreme, referring to other people as lesser mortals, and bragging that he had untangled every knot except for death. When he was labeled as a heretic for his lifestyle, he would beat Nick Romano by 900 years when he responded that a rich and broad, yet short life was superior to a long, narrow one. But this cockiness was warranted. His Canon of Medicine is the first work to identify contagious disease, though he did not know about microbes. And it was an encyclopedia of medical knowledge. It described hundreds of herbal medicines, anatomy, muscular structure, even biochemistry. It remained the primary text for medical study in European universities well into the 17th century. In the study of physics, Ibn Sina believed that light possessed a finite speed and that it was composed of particles. 900 years later, Einstein would win the Nobel Prize in 1921 for proving this. In direct contrast to Ibn Sina's pride, we have al-Biruni. Now, if you read part 1, you know I'm a little obsessed with al-Biruni, so I'll try my best to contain my esteem and not come off too biased. By the by, our clip art for al-Biruni comes from Emil Hendricks, going off of my descriptions, because there are no contemporary images of him, and we don't want to steal someone else's art. And so we've made our own, with, in my opinion, as much accuracy as possible. So anyway, al-Biruni comes from extremely poor parents, and he remained known for his humility throughout his lifetime. He wrote about 140 books. One of those texts, Questions and Answers, poses a series of queries to Ibn Sina for him to answer. 10 of these questions relate to arguments made by Aristotle and maintained by Ibn Sina. One such question relates to the classical assertion that objects shrink as they cool, and al-Biruni asked why it is that water, when frozen, expands. Ibn Sina is unable to give a suitable answer. Another relates to Aristotle's opinion that planets must move in a perfect circle or else a vacuum would occur. Al-Biruni points out that, according to his astronomical observations, planets move in an oval pattern, without any vacuum occurrences. To which Ibn Sina can only respond that the celestial sphere is tantamount to perfection, and so different from the celestial spheres that Al-Biruni is observing. So Aristotle is still right? Yeah, Al-Biruni doesn't accept that. Ultimately, Ibn Sina gets so annoyed with this younger scholar poking holes in his views that he calls in his best student to finish responding to the queries, essentially stating that he's too important to field these questions from an inferior. So yeah, Al-Biruni is arguably the greatest polymath of the entire age. He forged advancements in astronomy, linguistics, physics, mathematical geometry, and medicine. But, and here he differs from a lot of the other greats we're discussing, Al-Biruni was a historian. You can see why I'm obsessed with him, right? He's considered to be the father of anthropology for his study of India. He spent several years studying Hinduism and collecting accounts of the customs, advancements, and traditions of India. His work is famously impartial, seeking to understand and appreciate rather than appropriate or downgrade. Forget Herodotus and his giant man-eating ants of India. Al-Biruni is my father of history. His chronology of extant nations was a macro history and focused on things like varying time measurement systems used by ancient and contemporary religions. Al-Biruni's greatest achievements were in astronomy and mathematics. He famously measured the circumference of the Earth with 99.5% accuracy by using an astrolabe and trigonometry to measure shadows. He humorously remarked that his method does not require walking in deserts, a ribbing of Al-Mansur's team we discussed in Part 1. He argued that the Earth rotates on its axis 600 years before Galileo. He also investigated the matter of a heliocentric universe, but he believed that the data available could not conclude either a geocentric or heliocentric one. Alright, let's keep moving. Next, we have Alqurismi, arguably the greatest mathematician of the entire age. He carried on where AlKindi left off in terms of popularizing the Hindu-Arabic numeral system. His greatest achievement is still named after him, the field of algebra. Alqurismi was not the first person to use algebraic equations. That honor probably goes to the Alexandrian Greek Diophantus. But Alqurismi was the first to outline a general procedure for solving algebraic equations. He invented a school of thought where the shay, or unknown integer such as x, could now be manipulated rather than just being a placeholder for an unknown quantity. His mathematic ingenuity was so colossal that he would reside as the principal mathematician of the West for nearly 1,000 years. I had teased you about Yoda, and we'll finally come to that with our next figure, Ibn Roost, known in the Latin world as Averroes. He was perhaps the most widely known Arabic philosopher in the Christian West. Thomas Aquinas referred to him as the commentator for his extensive analysis of Aristotle. He's considered to be the father of secular thought in Europe, and he certainly did much in the Islamic world here as well. A widely regarded conservative theological text was The Incoherence of the Philosophers, in which the author, Al-Ghazali, argued in favor of the theory of particulars. The idea here is that scientific reasoning has no place in understanding the natural world, that every observable event was a minuscule incident of divine intervention. Start a fire? There's no chemical reaction taking place here. That's just Allah willing a fire to exist. Ibn Rushd shot back with his Incoherence of the Incoherence, great title, in which he argues for an observable set of natural laws constructed by Allah in order to manage these events. We go back again to this reoccurring ideal that the study of natural law and science gets one closer to the divine, and that humanity is intended to do this. Ibn Rushd also has the honor of being the only identifiable Muslim scholar in Raphael's The School of Athens. You can find him right here, looking over the shoulder of Pythagoras. And while this is certainly a testament to his pervasiveness, Ibn Rushd was also known in a galaxy far, far away, for none other than the greatest of all Jedi was familiar with his writings. Ibn Rushd wrote that, quote, ignorance leads to fear, fear leads to hatred, and hatred leads to violence. Unquote. If your headcanon doesn't maintain that Yoda was a fan of medieval Arabic philosophy, then you must be a Sith apologist or something. Also, to continue on the pop culture bandwagon, Raphael did include a black figure in green robes in the School of Athens, but scholars haven't been able to identify him. He's right up there in the upper right corner. That's probably not Al-Biruni. He wasn't very well known until the 20th century, so this further cements Raphael as my least favorite Ninja Turtle. Alright, back to seriousness. Aljahees is one of the greatest scholars to come out of Africa. Born in Basra to East African parents, Aljahees helped to peddle fish while being self-taught as a child. When his writings were discovered, he was moved to Baghdad and entered the Beit al-Hikmah. Later in life, he was selected by Caliph al-Mamun to tutor his children, but the intensity of his eyes so scared them that the lessons never took hold. Aside from terrifying children with his gaze, he was another phenomenal polymath who wrote over 200 books. There's that number again. His most influential works were in literature and biology. He is regarded as one of the fathers of the Arabic literary tradition, with a focus on reforming and restructuring the language. He's also famous for writing the first example of the satire genre. However, it is his Book of Animals which is his most well-known. In it, he proposed the idea of common ancestry for canine species and discussed how animals adapt to suit their environment. He wrote this over 1,000 years before Charles Darwin. In strong fitting with the anti-racist ambition of this blog series, Aljahees also was a pioneer in anthropology and race. When investigating different skin colors across the known world, he wrote that, quote, "White and black are the results of environment, the natural properties of water and soil, distance from the sun, and intensity of heat. There is no question of metamorphosis or of punishment, disfigurement, or favor meted out by Allah." Unquote. Lastly, like any good bibliophile, popular myth holds that he died when a tower of books fell on him while he worked in his private library. Death goals. Now, like any good scientific age, it should be clear that there's no shortage of geniuses here. But the Arabic Golden Age doesn't just give you intellectual titans. Oh no. It even gives you a mad scientist, who is also a genuine scientific titan. Enter Jabir ibn Hayan. If you've ever heard the word gibberish, the etymology of that word comes from 16th century European scientists trying to make sense of some of Ibn Hayyan's nonsensical ramblings. He was fairly obsessed with the idea of takween, or the artificial construction of life. Sound familiar? One of his more madcap theories speculated on using bird semen to impregnate human women and create a race of winged people. But make no mistake, behind the mad scientist was a world-class scientist. Ibn Hayyan was a pioneer in the use of precise measurements and helped to establish the science of quantities. His book of alchemy is chock full of legitimate chemistry. Over his lifetime, Ibn Hayyan gave us the concepts of crystallization, distillation, evaporation, calcination, sublimation, and alkaline. He pioneered the field of applied organic chemistry in the use of sal ammoniac. He invented anti-rusting techniques and used manganese dioxide to make glass and tan leather. He invented methods for glazed ceramics, steel, dyes, and varnishes, and he developed distillation furnaces for coloring glass and for smelting. And as an adoring fan of Scotland, I've got to give him yet another credit: the invention of the alembic, which eventually made its way to Scotland and Ireland, where it was adopted to produce the first whiskey. Even in its fiction, the European scientific revolution just cannot compete. Ziyab, which translates to blackbird, was what I like to think of as a queen, if Queen was a one-man band born in Africa at the start of the 9th century. With the charisma, style, and musical talent of Freddie Mercury and the scientific know-how of Brian May, Ziyab is the cultural powerhouse of the Arabic Golden Age. And yes, of course he's also a scientific scholar. After getting driven out of Baghdad by a jealous instructor, he made his way across Africa to the court of Andalusia. Fashionable and hygienic, he popularized the use of deodorants, seasonal clothing, and musical traditions across the Islamic world. He is credited with inventing toothpaste, and while his written recipe does not survive, we know from other accounts that his toothpaste was effective in preventing tooth decay and freshening breath. He reportedly knew 10,000 songs by heart, invented numerous musical stylings, such as the forefathers of the Spanish guitar and flamenco, and even invented the three-course meal as a custom. You've got to be pretty awesome to make me second-guess my ranking of al-Biruni. But Ibn Khaldun is up to the task. Born in Tunisia in Africa, Ibn Khaldun is a powerhouse of the humanities. His works of history cover more cultures and subjects than al-Biruni's, but it is his works of sociology and economics that truly demonstrate his skill. He discussed the division of labor 400 years before Adam Smith. He developed the principle of labor value over 400 years before David Ricardo. He coined the theory of population over 400 years before Thomas Malthus. And he discussed the role of the state in the economy 600 years before John Maynard Keynes. On top of all this, he developed a coherent and comprehensive model of economic theory using all these principles. Last but certainly not least, we have Ibn Battuta. A Berber from Morocco, he is regarded as the greatest traveler of the Middle Ages. He spent 29 years traveling the width and breadth of the Islamic world, and he further extended his travels across North Africa, India, the Horn of Africa, and much of Southeast Asia. He was a scholar of Islamic law and earned his keep on his travels as a political advisor and ambassador. Though he made no great scientific discoveries of his own, he was well versed in the Arabic scientific tradition. His accounts of the Great Pestilence, for example, are notable for analyzing the contagious nature of the pestilence. And there you have it, our brief foray that just scratched the surface of the cream of the Arabic Golden Age. I hope you've enjoyed learning about these fantastic and noble figures and their iconic discoveries. Please do join us for the culmination of this blog series, where we'll look at all the different ways that the Arabic polymaths influenced GSM's traditional setting, the Bristol Renaissance Fair. I suspect you'll be surprised at some of the things found there that we owe to these great sages. Special thanks to Chuck Benworth for lending the use of his photographic gift to this blog, and to Amelin Hendricks for trying her best to visually capture my impression of al-Biruni. See you next time!